Well, it's just the two of us now and all those lovely people it's really exciting to watch the little names coming up. We've got, oh, hi, and hello, everyone. Hello, Rebecca. Hi from everyone. Oh, it's so exciting. So this is my first ever online event. So I'm probably very likely to make an idiot of myself, and I apologize in advance for that. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you all virtually. So although I can't see any of you, I can sense your presence. So hello. It's a real treat to be talking to Merlin about his book. If you haven't got hold of a copy, it's completely mind-blowing. It's a kind of revelatory, complex manifesto that gestures towards new ways of looking at, well, everything, really. So it's going to be really thrills and spills. There's some scary bits in it. There's some bits that are really, truly just, you know, sort of slap yourself after you read them. So I'm going to just start off. I know you wanted to read some passages from the book, Merlin. And it's such a pleasure to see your face again. Many years ago, I worked with Merlin in the same university department. So we have got this kind of like academic history together. It's been many years. If you mention fungi to most people, I guess most of us are going to think of a toadstool or a portobello mushroom in a grocery store. But that seems to be a bit like trying to sort of point out what the world is by gesturing at a pebble. Could you sort of just introduce fungi for us, please?
Of course. Well, it's good to be here, and thanks for having me, Stephen, and thanks for having me, Emergence magazine, and thanks, Helen, for agreeing to play. So the fungal world fungi are a whole kingdom of life. It's easy to forget that this broad category, this broad and busy category, is bigger than animals and plants, much bigger than plants. In fact, there are about 6 times as many fungal species as plant species. So it's a very broad and very busy category, and we know too little about it. But when we think of a mushroom, we're thinking of a fruit or a flower. It's like analogous to a fruit or a flower of a plant. So just this small ephemeral organ of a larger organism. And most fungi live most of their lives as mycelial networks, which are these sprawling, fusing, branching networks of tubular cells known as hyphae.
And they can be huge. They can be absolutely enormous.
They can be enormous, yeah. The biggest organism in the world, or at least one of the biggest organisms in the world, is a fungal network in Oregon that sprawls over 10 square kilometers. So they can also be tiny. They can fit on you have mycelial networks that exist on a speck of house dust. So these are there's a lot of ways to be a fungus.
It's really, I mean, there's a wonderful part at the beginning of your book where you talk about a friend of yours, David Abrams, who's a philosopher and also a close magician, and how he used to work or was working at Alice's restaurant, and he would do kind of table magic. He'd come around with coins and impress people with his tricks. And I don't know if I'm sure many of people watching have seen close quarters magic, and it's really, really dizzyingly strange. It's really hard to comprehend what you're seeing is happening. It's obviously not happening, but it really is weird. You think if you can get close enough, you can work it out, but no. And you talk about how quite frequently people would come back into the restaurant after having seen this magic, and they kind of almost complain that has he put something in their drinks, because the world outside suddenly seemed richer, brighter, the sort of water on the sort of sidewalk was sort of glowing in the clouds, and you talk about how what those tricks do to the people that watch them is they suddenly sort of force them out of their preconceptions about what they expect the world to look like and what they expect the world to be. And I think one of the great things about your book is how remorselessly and beautifully and excitingly that is what you show us mushrooms and fungi can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a big part of it. I mean, the way that these organisms can change the way we think and feel and imagine, it's a considerable power that they have. And not just fungi, of course, bacteria, plants, animals, but fungi are just particularly neglected, and so they seem stranger to us. We're less adapted to their ways and their peculiarities, or their normalcies rather. They seem strange to us, but that David Abrams story it's one I keep coming back to. This idea that what we see normally when we look at the world is what we expect to see. We update our expectations with small new amounts of sensory information, and when we actually see, when we loosen the grip of our expectations and we look and we see what is actually there, the surprise we feel, the gap between what we expect to find and what we actually find when we choose to look is a surprising gulf.
It's this is a bit of a craft point here. I get very excited when I used to do talks about my book Ages for Hawk. It used to be about birds and grief, and every so often someone would ask me a question about actually writing a book, and I used to get very excited about it because they were quite rare. So I want to just go straight in and say, you know, that the narrative of this book is wonderfully fungal. You talk about it as a book in which you attempted to write a portrait of fungi, but that wasn't possible. And what it ended up being was a kind of tangled, sorry, I've got the notes here, I'm like a newsreader. And it's a sort of tangled account of your journey towards understanding the lives of fungi, but also how fungi have affected you. There's this wonderfully reflexive sort of sense to it. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, about the book coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was a real adventure to try and render these organisms in a way that would be exciting and also would be comprehensible. Most of the time I spent writing the book was trying to wrestle my own way into understanding them, or dance my own way into understanding these organisms. And they'd evade and slip away from me whenever I tried, because so many of these ideas, the more you think about them, the stranger they get. Like this idea of having a decentralized organism, no head or heart, no brain, no skull, no center of operations, no center of control. And this idea of decentralized organisms is foreign to us as centralized organisms. And so to wrap my thoughts around that required feeling in with metaphors and stories that I thought might help render them in a more comprehensible way. So there was a lot of feeling, and using music. Music was very helpful for me, because music is I thought of this as fluid and indeterminate and polyphonic, and this was a very helpful guide for me, a guiding figure. Mm-hmm. And knots were too. I've always enjoyed tying and untying knots, and fungi are habitual knot tiers with themselves, and they tangle and untangle and retangle, and so knots were a helpful way to fidget with these ideas. And also
fidgeting, wonderful, wonderful word. I should be using that when I talk about writing in the future. Sorry to butt in. I get very excited.
Of course. So there were all, and then trying to maintain contact with them. So growing mushrooms and brewing and going outside and putting my hands in the soil, they're really basic things, and eating lots of mushrooms, and these ways of just maintaining contact with this realm, and not to float too far away from it. That was really important.
It is a wonderfully grounded book in that regard. I love that sense that you're never too far from the sort of material world. And I was really moved towards the end. You talk about how, your early life with your father showing you the natural world by kind of in a very sort of sensual kind of way, not in dubious way, but just kind of getting you into sort of piles of leaves and putting your face into flowers. And I think that sense of kind of a kind of epistemology of touch and of the senses is really, really clearly kind of evoked in this book. Would you like to read a section?
Of course.
I'm really excited.
And but very briefly on that note, I think this idea of participation is very important, right? When we participate in these living stories around us as students of the living world, we all are students of the living world, and that's a participatory process, and whether we're like or not, we admit it. So I think this admitting our participation and enjoying our participation is a wonderful way to
when you talk about literally, we're constantly being participated by fungi and bacteria. I mean, they're all over us and in us. I mean, it's really. Anyway, I'm going to get ahead of myself there.
So I just wanted to read from the beginning of this chapter called "Living Labyrinths," and it's one piece of prior knowledge that might be helpful is that hyphae is the name for these, the plural of the name for these tubular fungal cells. Singular is hypha, plural is hyphae. Imagine that you could pass through two doors at once. It's inconceivable, yet fungi do it all the time. When faced with a forked path, fungal hyphae don't have to choose one or the other. They can branch and take both routes. One can confront hyphae with microscopic labyrinths and watch how they nose their way around. If obstructed, they branch. After diverting themselves around an obstacle, the hyphal tips recover the original direction of their growth. they soon find the shortest path to the exit. If one follows the growing tips as they explore, it does something peculiar to one's mind. One tip becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, yet all remain connected in one mycelial network. Is this organism singular or plural? I find myself wondering, before I'm forced to admit that it's somehow, improbably, both. Watching a hypha explore a single clinical maze is bewildering, but scale up. Imagine millions of hyphal tips, each navigating a different maze at the same time within a tablespoon of soil. Scale up again. Imagine billions of hyphal tips exploring a patch of forest the size of a football field. Mycelium is ecological connective tissue, the living seam by which much of the world is stitched into relation. In school classrooms, children are shown anatomical charts, each depicting different aspects of the human body. One chart reveals the body as skeleton, another the body as a network of blood vessels, another the nerves, another the muscles. If we made equivalent sets of diagrams to portray ecosystems, one of the layers would show the fungal mycelium that runs through them. We would see sprawling, interlaced webs strung through the soil, through sulfurous sediments hundreds of meters below the surface of the ocean, along coral reefs, through plant and animal bodies, both alive and dead, in rubbish dumps, carpets, floorboards, old books in libraries, specks of house dust, and in the canvases of old master paintings. According to some estimates, if one teased apart the mycelium found in a gram of soil, about a teaspoon, and laid it end to end, it could stretch anywhere from 100 meters to 10 kilometers. In practice, it's impossible to measure the extent to which mycelium perfuses the Earth's structures, systems, and inhabitants. Its weave is too tight. Mycelium is a way of life that challenges our animal imaginations.
That is just really beautifully sets forth how mind-expanding, pondering this fungal life is. And there's a bit where you talk about mycelia and how you could possibly sort of think of the sort of notion of human lives and how the tip of the hypha as it moves, the very tip is your current moment in life, and everything behind it, that sort of spreading mat, is your past. I mean, again and again in this book, I would come across metaphors that kind of, sort of kick me out of my familiar ways of thinking. One of the things I do in my own work, and I try to, is to talk about how when we look at the natural world, humans, inevitably see it through the lenses of their own cultures, their own societies, and they tend to see it in nature, visions of themselves. We want to look at things in the nature and natural world and get them to prove back to ourselves the way the world is, or the way we think the world should be. And again, this is something that mushrooms and fungi are failing to give us. Can you just why have they been so neglected? Why are they so invisible to us when they are ubiquitous and used? I mean, brewing and bread and it's just everywhere, and we use them all the time. Why are they not a concept that we're familiar with?
It's a good question. So one of the reasons is technological, and it's only recently with improvements in microscopes and DNA sequencing methods that this microscopic world has become available to us. It's a bit like the boom in the microbial sciences more generally, with bacteria and the microbiome in our stomach. And we have these molecular tools that allow us to go into these places and to see who's where. And so that's a really big deal. And before that, we could look through microscopes. The microscopes have been around for a while, but you can only see so much through a microscope, and it's hard to distinguish quite how many fungal types might be around. They often look similar to the eye. So that's one of the reasons is that these worlds are just becoming available to us in a new way. Another reason is that in the 1960s, fungi and bacteria won their independence, taxonomically speaking. They used to be considered plants. And so there was Department of Animal Sciences, there were departments of plant sciences, there were no departments of fungal sciences. So, and within departments of plant sciences, mycology was this kind of neglected, dusty, unfashionable corner, even though fungi have for a long time had a big role in industry and lots of commercial applications, such as brewing or the production of citric acid or penicillin. These have been around for the 20th century in a big way. So I think a big reason is that they now thought of as their own kingdom, and so we can treat them as their own subject.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we had a sort of brief rehearsal chat the other day, and there was this sort of great moment, we were talking about how in the kind of, amateur natural history world, there's this sort of unspoken kind of chain of being. So the bird people who like birds look down on the insect watchers and insect people, and then they look down on the plant people, and the plant people look down on the mushroom people, and then the mushroom people look down on the lichen people. Can we talk a little bit about, I want to go back to your field work, and there's an image that was really interesting to do with, this notion of technology allowing us to visualize what's going on. Actually, should we look at that now? This is something, let's do that now. You worked in Panama on a very interesting, exquisitely beautiful plant. Could you let us know about that?
So I was studying these plants. They belong to a group of plants called mycoheterotrophs, which is a terrible name for them, really. But they're very charismatic, beautiful plants, and they don't photosynthesize. They've lost the ability to photosynthesize. And with it, they've lost their green color, and with it, they've lost their leaves. So they've got these pale white stalks, and they might look anemic were it not for the fact that they're just so bold and striking and contrarian in this forest of green plants. And so they've struck out on this different direction, and the way they survive is by drawing their nutrients from fungal networks, and these fungal networks themselves draw their carbon, their energy containing carbon compounds from other plants. So these mycoheterotrophs, they hack the wood wide web in some sense. They pull nutrients from this shared network.
Yeah.
So I'd be studying these plants, and I was captivated by them, and for me they represented these they're sort of periscopes into the mycorrhizal underground, into the fungal underground, and I could use them to get a picture, to gauge what was going on underground in this very busy forest. When I'd go back to the field station, I had these Dutch friends who were studying the big ecology. They were going out to measure the girth of trees, and so macho. And
you were looking for flowers. You were looking for delicate flowers on the forest floor. Merlin, so proud of you.
So we'd have a lot of fun. They'd tease me about my dainty fascinations. I'd tease them about the machismo. And of course, you need big ecology, and you also need small ecology. Not that small ecology is actually small. It just isn't.
It's a scale situation. Absolutely.
It is a scale situation.
So sorry, carry on.
Well, there are these plants, so the plants that I spent most time looking at, and so then in the roots of these plants, you have very amazing, dense fungal scene. There's essentially fungal farms in the roots of these plants, and so these are great to look at under the microscope. And so that's what I have. I have a video of a laser scan of one of these roots, and
Sure.
what you need to know is that the scan is made with you stain the roots with a fluorescent stain that stains the plant tissue one color and the fungal tissue another color. So when you render the 3D image, the plant is in one color and the fungus is another. And so in this case, the plant's in blue-green color and the fungus is in red. And you can turn up or down the plant, so you'll see the plant becoming transparent and then taking on substance again. So let's see if this works.
Just to sort of get across the astonishingly intimate relationship that exists. There's a one bit in your book where you talk about how a plant isn't really a plant without fungi. It's it makes no sense to think of a plant in the wild state without there being fungi involved in it.
Absolutely, and I mean really should be thinking about plants as algae that have evolved to farm fungi, and fungi that have evolved to farm algae.
Can you rotate it, Merlin? It's not moving on my screen?
No, I haven't started it yet.
Oh,
so now it's
sorry, I thought that was me.
No, there you go. So you can see the fungal hyphae. They live inside the root, but they also extend outside the root because they branch and ramify into the soil where they obtain nutrients for the plant. So now we're going to go up and down and round and inside. I always wanted to do this when I was looking at these things under normal optical microscopes, so glass lensed light microscopes. But
This is reminding me very much of something else we're going to talk about in a little while, which is some more psychedelic aspects of fungi usage. That's really phenomenal, Merlin. Thank you so much for that.
Of course, yeah.
And again, it's, you know, as you said, as we were saying about how, you know, the development of that kind of technology to visualize those things is part of how we can get to see them now. But we need people to communicate that to us all, because, you know, those kind of things tend to stick in specialist journals. Although I must admit, I did get in quite trouble. I was filming a few months ago actually now, and with a very esteemed mycologist from a very eminent organization, which I shall not name. And he was quite a grumpy person, like some people who work on fungi, not all, of course. And I was talking about how wonderful it was that how, you know, recently we've discovered these networks. And he turned around and fixed me with a baleful gaze and said, "We've known about it for a long time. It's just you lot that are catching up." And I didn't know what to say to him. I said, I meant the 20th century. I didn't mean like this week. It was really funny, but it made me realize, you know, that is there a sense in which mycologists are sort of trying to sort of, do they enjoy the sort of popularization of this? Are they excited about it? Or do they worry that that the metaphors kind of spin out of control? Or is this kind of...
So, I mean, there is some sense, I think in general, specialists in the field are very happy when they have, you know, more people wanting to study this subject, more students, and more excited students, or a bigger portion of the available students. You know, in lots of universities, there's a fixed amount of students, and you get a little share of it. And so, in the whole, more people wanting to study the subject is exciting. There is, I think, some sense in which the popularization has allowed some of these metaphors to get out of control. Or at least that's a sentiment in some quarters of some aspects of mycology. But I think that's a fairly small part of the issue. You know, that's not in any field of science. You're going to have people who complain about the way that it's being discussed in the popular press. So yeah, I don't think that's unique to mycology in any way.
No. I wasn't casting aspersions on mycologists. Beautifully, this notion of the wood wide web, this network of mycelia stitching together plants and fungi and bacteria, you know, when you go into it further and start pulling apart what's really going on there and what might be going on, it's so much weirder than the metaphor might even suggest, that actually it is just kind of rabbit holes all the way down. It's phenomenal. So I wanted to talk about lichen and lichen in particular, because it's one of those places in the book where it's a really direct challenge to our understanding of identity. And there's a bit in your bit where you talk about the sort of 19th century, this initial notion that a lichen is a symbiotic system between an alga and a fungus. And there's this terrifying metaphor, which is, I sort of recalled from the page. And it was talked about as if the fungus was, I think, a wise statesman, and the alga was the sort of slaves that were kind of, you know, and I just thought that metaphor is so kind of fails to sort of describe what is actually going on inside a lichen, and is, you know, it really is one of those brute moments of realizing that we always see the world through our expectations, and sometimes expectations are not only noxious but completely misguided. So I'd love to hear a bit more about lichens from you.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, because it was actually fellow lichenologists became upset by it. So Simon Schwendener came up with the dual hypothesis of lichens, and he was the one who said that the fungi were these sort of tyrant masters, and the algae were the captives, slaves that are depressed into its service. But other lichenologists realized that the story was bigger than that, bigger than this limited cast of characters allowed, apart from the fact that they might have, you know, liked or disliked his choice of metaphor. And so that's why Albert Frank, this German botanist, coined the word symbiosis, or rather imported it into biology, because he felt that we needed a word that described the full spectrum of possible relationships and didn't presume to know what was going on, so that these relationships could be what they were rather than what we thought they were. And
exactly. And it's much more, it's a very complex system, yeah.
Totally, and that's what's so exciting about it now, is that, you know, for decades, or for over a century, lichenologists and botanists have squabbled over who's in charge. You know, this is often a question with symbiosis, like, who's in charge? Is it the alga's in charge because it has this way to do this with the fungus, or this thing to do this, and the fungus is in charge. And these arguments just goes backwards and forwards, and it's, we can step into a bigger room here, and that's what some lichenologists are doing. So there's someone called Toby Sprabilla who's discovered this the third and fourth partner in the lichen symbiosis, and another lichen thinker called Trevor Goward, who's a very amazing lichenologist. And they make the point that these lichens, these are systems. These are vibrant, shimmering, dynamical systems, and you can have different players in the lichen playing different parts, and it's not about fixed identity, it's about what things do. So it's the song that each partner plays rather than the singer that's important. So it's what each partner does rather than who they are. And so that's where we really get into this identity question. And that's why lichens remain these organisms that press hard against our notion of individuality.
They do, and then this, and obviously, it broadens one's understanding of so many human concepts to look at the natural world. When I sort of looked at, you look at acorn woodpeckers and their amazing polygamous mating systems, and you think, okay, it's not all just, like Disney true life adventures out there in the animal world. It's much more complicated and diverse. And then you look at fungi and you think, well, the very notion that there are, two genders, it's laughable. I think you mentioned one fungi with sort of 20,000 different.
Yeah, 23,000 different mating types. Yeah. Superb.
That's just really joyous. I love it. So one of the things I loved, one of the billion, I keep saying this, but there are so many things in this book that I could talk for literally hours with you. Everyone would be sort of sitting there thinking this was meant to be an hour long, is this wonderful cast of characters in your book. There are an enormous number of really pretty cool people who are not attached to the academic world at all. There are the whole bunch of these radical mycologists towards the end who are like something out of Mad Max. It's just marvelous, like across between Mad Max and William Gibson. They are doing the most bizarrely utopian things with fungi. Can you just take us through some of those people and what they're doing?
It's astonishing, yeah, this scene, and it's really part of this bigger world of DIY biology that's going on, which has its center of mass on the west coast of North America, perhaps unsurprisingly. But it emerges, it's a sort of hybrid from the DIY culture and the sort of permaculture and radical ecological thinking. And so it emerged actually a lot from these kitchen sink magic mushroom growers who are trying to find ways to produce these psychedelic mushrooms in the 70s and 80s and through the 90s. And these techniques can be generalized to cultivate lots of different types of mushrooms. So out of this magic mushroom growing scene has sprouted this very vibrant community of DIY mycologists who are growing mushrooms, growing fungi as food, as medicines, as ecological solutions, and partnering with these fungi in ways to digest pollutants like crude oil or other pollutants that might be around in the local environment.
Even nerve gas constituents. This stuff was just mind-blowing. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's Paul Stamets is really this sort of most well-known figure and has now been immortalized in Star Trek with Lieutenant Stamets, and that's really where we get into this place of this blurring of science fact and science fiction, and it's really quite perfect when we're talking about these fungal sciences, I think, because it's sometimes hard to tell what's fact and what's fiction. But Paul's the most well known, but there are many others. One amazing thinker and practitioner is Peter McCoy, who runs an online mycology school called Mycologos, and he's done as much as anyone to propagate fungal thinking and fungal knowledge, and his idea is to empower people to be able to work with these organisms in whatever way they want to, and to put these tools and put this knowledge into the hands of people who might not have been to universities to study it. And so he's a very amazing thinker. But there are so many people. There's an amazing group in Chile who have put fungi onto the governmental protection list, so that any new development, when you're doing your environmental survey, you have to do a survey of the fungi too. And because fungi are very neglected in these conservation surveys because they just don't feature, they're not on these radars. So there's very amazing people doing that work. There's all sorts of it's a fast-growing and bustling scene, and it's a thrill, really.
It is really thrilling and really good fun to read as well. And the McKenna and the sort of the magic mushroom growing and the ways in which you talk about how there is definitely a sort of a sense in which some people are really quite convinced that the beginning of human kind of evolution and society may have been intimately related with the of taking mushrooms, magic mushrooms. So and the reason I'm kind of like smiling like this is because I had a very misspent youth, and I had some, I did some activities when I was a student many years ago, and there's a bit in this book where you are lying under the influence of LSD. It's an experiment, it's a proper trial. It's not anything kind of recreational, and you're trying to rank and mark your experiences on a questionnaire. I actually laughed out loud. This is like one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. But can you tell us about how the kinds of ways in which people are looking anew at the abilities of psychedelic mushrooms, psychedelic fungi to change the way we think about self, but also be used in mental health?
It's thrilling. Another thrilling aspect of mycology, but it's, in some sense, it is news. We have the newest brain scanning techniques, the newest analytical methods being turned on the psychedelic experience, usually with psilocybin and sometimes with DMT and with acid as well. But psilocybin more commonly because it doesn't have quite the stigma of the 3 letters of LSD, and so easier to get permission to work with. So these studies have been finding amazing. They've been finding amazing things. So they combine the method of asking people about their experience. Of course, you can't get into someone's experience from outside, as we all know. So you have to ask people, but then, hence the questionnaires. But they also scan people's brains and can describe the experience in these brain scans. Of course, you can't explain the experience in the brain scans because it's people who have experiences, not brains. But what's amazing is that these seem to concur, that there seem to be strong correlates between what's going on in the brain and what we know about the brain and what's going on in people's experiences. And on the whole, what's happening is that the rigid habits of people's minds, the paths that we wander down every day, the route that you take from the part of your mind to the shops, that same street, the same right-hand turn, the same crossing the road, the same, people are branching out and they're taking new routes through their minds, and these whole open fields of possibilities are emerging, and these hardened, calcified categories and boundaries that we have to organize our minds are softening, and new cognitive and emotional possibilities open up. And it's those experiences which are so therapeutic, because people can the rigid pessimism and depression, anxiety, these things soften, and suddenly you don't have to take that route to the shop. You can actually just jump over the hedge and walk across that park and and sit under that tree and go, and it's a whole different experience of your mind, and that's often what we need. And so these drugs seem to be able to promote that kind of experience. Of course, psychedelics have been used by traditional cultures for a very long time. So for the cultures that are using these drugs, this isn't news at all. It's like what we've always known is that these medicines can heal us, can help us to do all sorts of things. And they have immense value in human lives and human cultures. So what's really beautiful is to see this convergence, is modern science catching up and giving value, attributing value to these things which have long been valued, and which is welcome. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that modern science is discovering the power of these methods.
Yes, you see, this is Merlin giving me a hard time because that was really quite lazy of me intellectually. Absolutely, I'm sorry. No. Absolutely, you should definitely have said that. But I mean, I think that one of the things I left this book with wasn't just that sense that kind of my mind had melted slightly, but also an enormous sense of hope. And that's a very rare thing to read in any book about the environment whatsoever these days. Before we leave, I really would like, I of course was completely squicked out and freaked out by your discussion of zombie insects. So I wonder if you'd like to terrify everyone a little and talk about mind control by fungi.
Well, it's very it's a fascinating subject, and then broadly speaking, there are lots of insects that are possessed by different sorts of fungi, and lots of fungi that possess different sorts of insects. But broadly speaking, these fungi need insect bodies to move, to locomote, to get from A to B, because the fungus doesn't have a twitchy muscular body. So so it borrows one, or rather commandeers one. And so in the case of Ophiocordyceps and carpenter ants, which is a very well-studied example, these ants would normally keep the low, shadowed, damp parts of the forest. But when they become infected with this fungus, which winds its way through their body cavities and tissues and around their muscle fibers, the ant becomes fascinated by light and by height, and it crawls out high on these plant stalks. And then it bites on with its death grip. It's called a very characteristic grip. And then the fungus sprouts a stalk out of its head, and spores rain down on the ants passing below.
Yeah.
But there are lots of examples of this. But what's fascinating is the way that we can think about these behaviors. This death grip, this isn't an ant behavior. This is a fungal behavior. And so it's very much the case that this is a fungus in ant's clothing. That this ant's body it's ceased to be on the tracks of the story of the ant and the ant's evolutionary stories and the story of its relationship with other ants. It becomes part of the fungal story. And so this is a shape-shifting, chimeric, it seems to blur this boundary of science and fiction and myth. And so all these stories and myths about transformations and werewolves and this becoming that and that becoming this, and and sphinxes and griffins and all these mixed creatures, these really are mixed creatures. And so I think it's really fascinating to think about the way that these organisms that can, for fungi to evolve an animal body, it would take, it would probably never happen, but even if it did, it would involve them sacrificing so many of their amazing superpowers, their indeterminacy, their need not to commit to this kind of developmental rigidity and these limitations. So instead they just acquire for a short period one of these bodies, which is good for some things and bad for others.
Bad for, yeah. And just, to end on, just that, how would you see, I read a wonderful book by the writer Ed Yong a while ago called, it's on the microbiome in the human body and bacteria and how much bacteria exists within us and is us. And fungi are the same, right? It's part of who we are. I wonder if you could just end on talking about a little bit, and then maybe if we've got time, and we're running a little late, but maybe you could read a little bit more.
Yeah, no, of course. But this is interesting. These questions of identity, I think, are really some of the most interesting ones that biological thinking is challenging us with. And then generally, so we have all these bacteria that live in our gut, and we wouldn't develop the way we do without these bacteria. We wouldn't behave the way we do. We wouldn't have evolved to be the creatures that we are without them. And so what is us, and how do we adjust our ideas to account for the fact that we are ecologies? And if we are ecologies, and we're living within ecologies, then how do we start to pry open some of our concepts of selfhood, to loosen some of our concept of selfhood, to include this the soft edges of ourselves? And if we have soft edges of ourselves, then how soft are they, and where do they stop?
Exactly.
And our selfhood our sense of self starts to look more like an assumption rather than a fact, a useful assumption that we need to live our day and live our life, but by no means biological fact. Have you heard of the rubber hand illusion?
I have heard, but please tell everyone, I have heard of this, but please.
I've been thinking about it recently. So the rubber hand illusion is, you have a rubber hand which is placed on a table in front of you, and it's made to look like your real hand's covered with a cloth, and so you can see this rubber hand. Your real hand is there, you can't see it, and then the rubber hand and your real hand is stroked simultaneously, but you can only see the rubber hand being stroked, but you feel your own hand being stroked. And after a few minutes of this, you start to believe that the rubber hand is your own, and it's astonishing to this is
you really believe it. It's not just sort of a weird illusion. You're like, that's my.
That's your hand. And so, and certain reactions in your body and the way that you send signals to your own hand, you weaken the kind of impulses that you send to your real hand, because you actually start withdrawing yourself from the real hand and investing it in this rubber hand. And this is after a mere 20 minutes of experience. We can revise our somatic maps This is a long period of evolution. This is a long period of our lives where we reliably have a hand, and yet we can still revise our somatic maps of ourselves. And I'm wondering what more we're capable of.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen has reappeared on the screen. Perhaps we have no time for it.
No, I think we would all love to hear another passage of your
I would
notes.
certainly love to hear another reading. I'm
Great.
reeling slightly from this sort of vision of possibility. It's really wonderful.
Okay, well, let's try. This is from a chapter on lichens called The Intimacy of Strangers. And it starts with a line from Adrienne Rich. The problem was that we did not know whom we meant when we said we. On June the 18th, 2016, the descent module of a Soyuz spacecraft landed on a bleak steppe in Kazakhstan. 3 people were pulled safely from the scorched capsule following a stint at the International Space Station. The astronauts weren't alone as they plummeted to Earth. Under their seats were hundreds of living organisms packed tightly in a box. Among the samples were several species of lichen that had been sent into space for 1.5 years as part of the Biology in Mars experiment, BioMex. BioMex is an international consortium of astrobiologists who used trays mounted on the outside of the International Space Station, a piece of apparatus known as the EXPOSE facility, to incubate biological specimens in extraterrestrial conditions. Let's hope they have a safe return, Natushka Lee, one of the BioMex lichen team, remarked to me a few days before the landing was scheduled. I wasn't sure who she meant by they, but soon afterwards, Lee got in touch to say that all was well. She had received an email from a lead researcher at the German Aerospace Center in Berlin and read out the subject line, relieved. Exposed trays back on Earth. Soon, Lee smiled, we'll have our samples back. A number of organisms with extreme tolerances have been sent into orbit, from bacterial spores to free-living algae to rock-dwelling fungi to tardigrades, microscopic animals known as water bears. Some can survive if shielded from the damaging effect of solar radiation, but few, apart from a handful of lichen species, are able to survive in full space conditions, drenched in unfiltered cosmic rays. So remarkable are these lichens' abilities that they have become model life forms for astrobiological research. Ideal organisms to discern, as one researcher writes, the limits and limitations of terrestrial life. It isn't the first time lichens have helped humans to fathom the limits of life as we know it. Lichens are living riddles. Since the 19th century, they have provoked fierce debate about what constitutes an autonomous individual. The closer we get to lichens, the stranger they seem. To this day, lichens confuse our concept of identity and force us to question where one organism stops and another begins.
Wonderful. Thank you, Merlin. This has been enormously fun and really, really thrilling and mind-blowing. I would love to get some questions from...
Yeah, well, thank you both. This is the point of the event, the conversation, that I just want to keep it going, and like, let's go have a beer, you know. I just want to, a few people have asked throughout, we are recording and we're going to share the video later, so you can share it yourselves to people who couldn't be here or rewatch as well. We have about 9 questions here. I'm going to kind of go through. Actually, I'm going to ask you first. Selfishly, I want to ask this idea of sort of entanglement that seems to be kind of becoming more prevalent in the biological sciences, I think, as well, of your book and David Quammen's The Tangled Tree. And I wonder if you can, either of you or both of you can talk a little bit about how our ideas of evolution are evolving as we sort of unveil these new networks and we learn more about the natural world and the sort of ambiguity. Merlin, you mentioned in the book this concept of involution, which I found really intriguing.
I love this concept. Natasha Myers, an amazing thinker, a real hero of mine, and she's at York University, and she uses this term to describe the way that she says that evolution describes a rolling outwards. It's this idea of divergence, everything diverging and diverging and diverging. But it doesn't capture the willingness of organisms to involve themselves in each other's lives. And as we know more, as we find out more about evolution, and really the history of the 20th century evolutionary study of evolution has been this growing importance of symbiosis, the relationships between organisms, and symbiosis as a source of evolutionary novelty. These coming together and staying together of organisms being a whole new way of finding biological possibilities, biological novelty arising from the novel combination of organisms. And so involution, in her words, describes this tendency to involve ourselves, to involve others. And we know this very well as social beings. As beings, we're social with other humans, but we're also social with non-humans. And the whole story of domestication is one of us being involuted and involving ourselves with these organisms that open up new possibilities for us, whether it be plants, wheat, potatoes, or animals, horses permitting new forms of transport, yeast permitting new forms of intoxication. The whole story of humanity is one of involving ourselves with the lives of others. So it's nice to see this involution becoming a really large part of the history of life right from the beginning.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a few questions about music and your relationship with music. Daryl Moore asks if there was any music in particular, and how does it relate to the fluidity that you talked about earlier? And then another question from Kaylee Kassenheiser, a longer question, which you can also look at in your Q&A, but she refers to a polyphonic form known as the hocket. Are you familiar with the hocket? Okay, yeah, and that was her question, and she said, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about how you understand mycelium as a polyphony in bodily form.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when I was thinking about mycelium, I was wrestling with this tension between it being a multitude of growing tips, but at the same time, more than that, because all the growing tips are connected to each other. So it's one coherent whole. It's an interconnected network, but at the same time, these growing tips are exploring and branching and fusing, and in themselves can be thought of as the sort of unit of a mycelial network. So I wanted to find a way of exploring this singular plural and both at once idea, and I really found that in polyphonic music, where you have no lead tune, there's no main line. If you played a piece of polyphonic music to 10 people and asked them all to sing back the tune, they'd all sing something different, because each voice finds its own way through the music, and they wind and twist and intersperse. And what you end up with is a piece of music that makes a coherent piece. If you lean back and let your ears soften, then a whole joint sound emerges, and that's like the whole mycelial network. But if you try and find your way in by following a particular line, then you wind and twist among the other voices winding and twisting, and in that sense you're becoming more like a hyphal tip. And so I could flip from tip to whole network quite easily with my mind and my ears if I played with this for a while, and I find that a helpful way to explore this way that something can be singular and plural at the same time, and we don't have to resolve it. We can leave it in this sort of shimmering ambiguity.
Beautiful.
Wow, beautiful analogy. That's really lovely.
Yeah, it really is. Sherilyn asks, you're a scientist and yet you write like a poet, and she wonders if there's any literary inspirations that you're willing to share with us.
It's such a funny thing. It's amazing how surprising it strikes people that science would involve poetic thought or poetic language. And it's funny because in science we have metaphors, we use metaphors and analogies all the time, because most of science is an attempt to come to grips with things which are outside the reach of our senses, and we have to think of them in representational, analogic, poetic, image-based ways, because we have no other way to do it. So I think it would be a great possibility for this class, which is poetry for scientists and science for poets. And I think there'd be a lot of overlap, surprising overlap in surprising places. And the idea that science is an exercise in cold-blooded rationality, I think is in part a
Now, the whole two cultures debate, sorry, I'm jumping in, but the whole two cultures, the arts and the sciences, and never the twain shall meet is, I mean, it's extravagantly kind of, you know, it was a huge deal kind of in the sort of, you know, the 40s, 50s. There used to be poetry classes at Cambridge University for scientists, and they used to try and do things like explain metaphor using scientific diagrams of apples. And I mean, it was just terrible. But this notion that when you're a scientist, you have to put aside your poetic, lyrical apprehension of the world, particularly if you're writing, I think it's a genre question. Science papers aren't supposed to have, you know, poetry. And I think one of the joys of, you know, what I did when I left academia is moving away from that notion and opening out one's style as well as what one writes about in order to incorporate many more forms of style. Sorry, I butted in, Merlin.
It's okay. No, that's totally fine.
Particular works that inspire you, or
yeah. So what was in? There were so many things. I would read things like treat them like drugs. I had this sort of pharmacopoeia of books, and I'd read some, you know, some novelist or some nonfiction or some poet. There was something they could bring. It depends. So Laurie Lee would give me. I loved his similes. You know, he had these open-hearted similes that would be such a medicine sometimes. So there'd be Laurie Lee on the desk. You know, there'd be a friend of mine, Edison Orban, who's very amazing with metaphor, and you know, he'd be on the desk for when I was like, I need to pay more attention to the stability of my metaphors. You know, I'd read a bit of Teddy's work, and that would help me find focus with my metaphors, this kind of thing. But I find that very helpful, and a way to. It's a bit like how I play music. You know, if I'm feeling like I'm getting into a rut, then I listen to someone else playing, and try and let that rub off on me. Try and become absorbent. You know, there's a sort of certain becoming absorbent, which is, I guess, it's a kind of listening and a practice of listening. And I found that very helpful in the writing process, because without that, then I couldn't move or shift or transform or get myself out of ruts. So
yeah.
All right. I think maybe we have time for maybe one more here. And this is from Sarah Delroy in Ontario, who thanks you for your book and said, "It brought me to tears many times, a great catharsis for these times," which is much needed, I think. Her question is that she works with children in woods, facilitating nature connection. And do you have any suggestions on introducing them to the world beneath the soil?
That's a really good question. I'm also so moved that the book would be so moving. And but I think that's something that there's a lot of story that has to happen, right? Because a lot of this can't be perceived with our own eyes. So just as the way that when we have plants, we're encountering plants, and you explain that these plants are growing and behaving, even though they're growing and behaving more slowly than we can perceive. You know, there's a way that our stories bring plants to life. And I think we have to, by extension, let our stories bring the soil to life, that this is this bustling wilderness. And if you smell it, you can smell the fumes coming out of this great forest of the underground. You know, that the forest is the soil is part of the forest, and what we see above ground is just this small part. And so I think story is a big way. I think maybe there are also games you can play about, and I'm open to collaborating and devising this kind of game. I've been thinking about it for a while now. How can we play these games to reduce our mammalian, our sort of muscular locomotive mammalian mind, and tune in more to our vegetal fungal selves? And I think there are ways we can play with language, possibly by deverbing. If you think about verbs as the muscles of our language, then if we deverb, maybe we could think more about being. And our contact with our surroundings by making, say, connections of nouns. Or this is just a very vague thought, but a combination of game playing and storytelling would be my first answer to that question. By no means my last answer.
Well, I think as any parent could say, that the children, we have a 16-month-old who, of course, is just drawn to dirt. And so that impulse is there already. And so now we just maybe finding those stories and the importance of those stories that you share in this book, and I think that are being more widely shared now.
And I think also, I mean, just if if a child is watching a plant grow, then a very simple thing would be to say that this plant is growing because the soil is allowing it to grow. You know, just by including the soil in the visible parts of the natural world that we talk about would be just go a long way already. So.
Well, it is now 1 o'clock, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to all the questions, but I might email them to Merlin, and maybe if he has some time, we can answer some of these, because there's some great questions that we didn't get to. And so I want to thank you both. This has been an absolutely wonderful way to spend an hour this afternoon. The book really is astonishing. If you watching have not yet got a copy, feel free to order from us, order from your local independent bookstore, get it from your library, whatever way you can get your hands on this book. Please read it. It really will change your perception of the world, which I think any piece of great literature can do, is to change the way that you view the world, and to make you feel a little more at home and a little more alien, I think, which is helpful. So Merlin, thank you for this book, and thank you for this afternoon. Helen, thank you. I'm really looking forward to seeing you again in October. Thank you everyone who is here watching today. We really appreciate this, and best of luck to everyone as we get through our series of ongoing crises. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for the support.
Thank you.
Bye bye everyone.